Hey everyone, welcome to Orb Creations, the show where I build an app, you get to see how I do it, and you get the source code in the description. Today we're building a client-side only notes app. What does that mean? Well, we're going to be able to write notes, save them, and load them to preview or edit later, all without a database. To get started with this notes app, we're going to clone the template repository from the Orb Cloud's GitHub account. Link is in the description. We use this repo to get started quickly on all of our Svelte apps. Once we have the repo cloned, the first thing we have to do is plan our routes. This Notes app needs routing because we want to show 3 screens to the user. A home screen to browse saved notes, an edit screen to create or update a note, and a preview screen to view the note for reading. The home path is pretty straightforward, but we're going to pass URL parameters for the edit and preview screens. This is better than keeping state in memory because if the user reloads on a page, the URL persists the app they're looking at. We're also going to use a markdown parser to automatically convert the user's markdown notes into HTML so that they can preview it. Stick around to see how that works. Before we start working on any of these UIs, let's understand the data model a bit. We're going to store the notes in a writable store during runtime. We're going to have a bunch of notes, and each note is going to be described by 3 things: a randomly generated ID, a name, and the contents that we write to it. We're also going to define a default note, which matches this interface and gets loaded on the user's first visit or if our persisted data is corrupted. Next, we'll define the logic for loading notes. I'm going to use local storage to persist notes across sessions. If the note is not found, then we'll load the default we defined instead. And if the note isn't valid JSON, then we'll also load the default notes. Finally, we're adding a bit of logic to write the note to local storage each time it updates. Okay, cool. Now let's look at the UI. We'll start with the home page. We'll start by importing some things we'll need for routing as well as the store and the defaults we just defined. Then we'll add a heading so the user knows where they are. This page is basically going to serve 2 purposes. The first is allowing the user to create or delete notes. And the second is showing a menu of saved notes so that the user can edit and preview. So we're going to make 2 UI sections for that. For the first part, we're just going to show a button to let the user create a note. And we'll have to remember to define a create note handler for it. We also want to have a button for the user to purge all their notes, so we'll need a delete all handler for that. And we only want to show this button if the user actually has notes to delete. Finally, we'll show a navigation menu that iterates over all the notes and displays the name of the note. For each note, we want to let the user edit, preview, or delete that note. So we're going to add links and buttons as appropriate for that. So in the end, we need 3 handlers for this UI: create note, delete all, and delete note. To create a note, we first have to generate a random ID, and we're going to use the available browser-native web APIs to do that. Then we're just going to update the notes by destructuring the previous note into itself and appending the new note. We'll then navigate the user to the edit screen. Deleting all notes is easy. We'll just set the notes store to the default notes. Remember that we already wrote the logic to auto-persist our note updates into local storage, so this should work out of the box. Finally, to delete a single note, we want to filter out the matching ID and write the filtered array to the store. Great, we have a home screen. Now let's make it pretty. I'm no designer, so this will have to do for now. Now let's go make the edit screen. First, let's import our navigation utilities and note store. We also want to expose a prop for reading the note ID from the URL parameter. Remember that we passed that in before? We'll want to find the current note in the store and use that note throughout this page. It's also nice to keep a copy of the note so that we can make comparisons later about whether the user has saved their changes or not. We're going to declare a reactive variable to do this, and it will just compare the original note to the note whose values are currently bound to the UI. If the values are different, then the user has unsaved changes. Editing a note is basically filling out a form, so we'll make use of the form tag for this. But first, a heading. When the form is submitted, we want the note to save, and since this is a single-page app, we don't want the browser's native form submission to trigger a navigation. We'll use the prevent default modifier for that behavior. Then we'll add the input and text area fields for editing the note's contents and bind the note's values to it. Add some labels for accessibility and a save button at the bottom, and that's the edit screen. All we need now are some buttons to help the user navigate. The handlers are relatively straightforward. We're going to define a utility function that serializes the notes and writes them to storage. This is useful in a few places where we want to autosave the user's work before they navigate away from the page. When the user clicks save, we'll call persist to save their note and then navigate them home. When the user clicks preview, we'll do the same and navigate them to the preview screen. But when the user clicks go back, we'll alert them to save their work because they may not have known that they had unsaved edits, and they may want to discard their changes. Okay, that's done. Now let's make it look pretty. Last but certainly not least, we're going to let the user view a preview of their note. Let's import the navigation utilities first, and also import the HTML sanitation and markdown parsing libraries that we'll use. HTML sanitation is important to avoid code injections. It's not as big of a deal for a totally client-side app like this, but we should still do it. Then we'll import the notes store, expose an ID prop, and find the note that matches the ID just like we did for the edit page. We're going to show our note inside an article tag because why not? Semantics are cool. Svelte has this nifty @HTML decorator that we'll use. It's equivalent to setting inner HTML. We're going to call the markdown parser on the note contents to get the HTML version of the note in a string, and then we'll sanitize it for rendering. Luckily, our libraries make it easy to render the HTML version of the markdown note. So this is all the code that we need. Finally, we'll just add some navigation buttons and handlers as we had on the other pages. Slap a heading on it and call it an app. Oh wait, let's make it pretty. And there you have it, a Notes app. The app is currently hosted on Orb at notes.orbapps.com. Link is in the description. All of the code that goes into this app is linked in the description. Be sure to check out these other videos on your screen right now. YouTube doesn't tell me ahead of time what they are, but I'm sure they're great. If you want to stay up to date on new apps I'm building and coding tips and tricks, be sure to hammer that subscribe button and follow us everywhere else. Until next time, remember, a pirate's favorite note is the high C.